Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Labelle. The EU and Belarus are at odds over illegal immigration. Guess what? Minsk has the higher cards. Also, Washington is again increasing tensions within Ukraine. Is the Biden administration looking to score a foreign policy victory to deflect from crises at home? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's a historian, analyst, and author of the book, Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And here in Moscow, we have Maxim Shchuchkov. He is director of the Center for Advanced American Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let's start out with Marcus in London. Well, the story with Belarus and Poland is gaining attention and intensity, by the way, about illegal immigration. Now, what the EU is saying, and particularly the Poles, is that these people are being dumped onto them. But Brussels is very hesitant for borders and fences, not to speak of walls here. But more and more people coming through. Belarus is saying these people are transiting here. There's something much more at play here, and I think it is that the Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, he's basically saying, you want to resolve this issue, you have to talk to me. Don't keep talking to Putin. Says he doesn't want to talk about it. It's really Belarus is forcing an issue for the European Union to actually start recognizing that Belarus has legitimate interests here, because we've seen that they don't want to have any kind of dialogue. Your thoughts, Marcus? Go ahead.
First of all, Peter, allow me to clarify a very important matter. There is only one migrant crisis engulfing Europe, and that is a migrant crisis which is in its 10th year now, caused by America, Britain, and France having destabilized both Libya and Syria through having supported Islamist terrorists in both countries, which has resulted in well over 1 million migrants entering Europe, most of whom have not come from Libya and Syria. But turning to the tension on the Polish-Belarusian border, the geostrategic dimensions to that are as follows. America and Britain are attempting to foment civil unrest in Belarus, or its historical name is Belorussia, in the hope that fomenting civil unrest in the country will assist them in their quest to initiate a coup in Belorussia against President Alexander Lukashenko that would wrestle Belorussia from Moscow's orbit and place it in the West's orbit, which would result in the western border of the Russian Federation, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, being entirely encircled, enclosed by countries which are in the West's orbit. That would be a tremendously dangerous situation for Russia. Now, whilst the chances of a Western coup in Belorussia occurring are negligible, nonetheless, anything is possible. There is also another dimension to this. America and Britain are looking for a pretext to continue increasing NATO's presence along the Russian border, both soldiery and weaponry. And by alleging that Belorussia, backed by Russia, is attempting to destabilize the European Union, destabilize NATO, by allowing migrants, illegal migrants, to enter Europe, that serves as a pretext for increasing NATO's presence in the East. And what has happened? Well, just in the last few days, Peter, British soldiers have been dispatched to Poland to advise the Polish government on how to secure its border. Well, that's quite laughable for a number of reasons, but one of them, Peter, is this, that the British state doesn't see fit to dispatch British soldiers to Dover to defend Britain's borders against illegal migrants who are crossing the English Channel on a daily basis. Indeed, only a few days ago, 1,000 illegal migrants entered Dover on one day alone.
Yeah, this whole tension between the European Union and Belarus, Maxime, really shows the wanting immigration policy of the European Union, because as Marcus has pointed out here, is that Brussels has basically just dropped the phone, because, you know, they're not particularly happy with the Poles in the first place right now for a lot of other internal union issues here. So it really kind of puts them in a bind. And then we have the European Union trying to communicate to Russia, to communicate to Belarus, and the Russians saying it's not our problem, it's your problem here. And Lukashenko is saying, well, let's talk, but they don't want to. I mean, it shows the weakness of the European Union's foreign policy, its immigration policy, even leadership here, because this can be resolved, because we do have an example, Maxime. It's called Erdogan, okay? I mean, they're willing to talk to Turkey, not a member of the European Union, about illegal immigration, but they're not willing to talk to Lukashenko because, what, are they too proud? Go ahead.
Right. Well, I think there are two lessons to learn for the Europeans from that crisis, and I think so far they have not been learning these two lessons. One is, if the Europeans are as concerned as they should be about the security and stability of the adjacent regions, North Africa and the Middle East, they perhaps should have stopped outsourcing a major decision-making to the United States that then falls prey to internal American domestic politics, right? And they should take their matters into their own hands, which they're not doing, as you just mentioned, and Marcus just showed. So they're asking for more kind of American and British support to take these, to solve these issues for them. And that's a problem in the long run. And the second lesson I think that they're not learning, that they should have be learning, is that turning states into failed entities has long-term consequences. So when there were all these interventions in Syria, Afghanistan, even Iraq, because a huge number of these migrants on the Polish-Belarusian border are Iraqi Kurds. What I think is missing in this discussion is how on earth did they end up on the Polish-Belarusian border, and why would they go there in the first place, right? They're not. I think there's little, if any, discussion on what's going on in the Iraqi Kurdistan. Why would people go to Europe now? And that these are serious questions that I think have not been addressed, and rather the Europeans keep looking for the quote-unquote Putin factor in every single challenge that they face, and I don't think it's a long-term solution.
Marcus, with this issue, with energy, they're loath to appreciate role in energy security, migration security. But, at the same time, they have to demonize Russia, but maybe the Russians can figure it out. I mean, it's a very weird kind of adolescent approach to foreign policy. And as you rightfully pointed out, the UK sends troops to Poland. I mean, this all started out because of military decisions in the Middle East. And now their best solution is to send troops. What about just sitting down and say, how can we negotiate the welfare of these people and figure out how they got there, why they got there? Presumably, gentlemen, these quote-unquote refugees bought plane tickets. So, I mean, these are well-off refugees. I mean, see, they're always looking for a blame game, but we don't even know who these people are. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, of course, if America, Britain, and the European Union were to sincerely analyze the reasons for the migration crisis, then it would totally annihilate their reasons for having intervened in both Libya and Syria. So obviously, they are not going to go down that pathway. However, there is a very, very obvious reason at play here as to why all focus is on Russia. It is because the Russia of today is not the Russia of the 1990s. If Vladimir Putin was a Boris Yeltsin, if he was compliant to Western wishes, to Western demands, if he allowed Russia to be dependent on the International Monetary Fund, then you would see a very different approach from the West. But of course, the reality is that under Vladimir Putin, not only has Russia regained its independence, which it lost to a very great extent during the 1990s because it was on an IMF life support machine. But not only that, Vladimir Putin has returned Russia as a great power, and even further, he has returned Russia as a superpower. And of course, the Americans look to Russia as the only country which can truly challenge its hegemonic role in the world. They do not look at China in the same way because they know that the Chinese economy is dependent on the American economy. So China is not able to challenge Russia in the same way. And as I said moments ago, the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border is not about migrants per se. It is about Russia. It is about finding another pretext to foment further civil unrest in Belorussia, to demonize President Lukashenko, who, in my estimation, has done a very good job in keeping Belorussia a very stable country since the end of the Soviet Union. And also it provides the West to continue beefing up its military presence in NATO and in the Black Sea region. That is what the crux of the matter is concerning the tension on the Polish-Belarusian border. It is about NATO increasing its presence along the Russian border.
So, Maxime, I think it's almost kind of a psychological thing, too. I mean, Brussels can't countenance the fact that Belarus can say no. They can say no and quote unquote get away with it here. And because of that attitude, they have taken options off of the table. Like I said, there's the Erdogan option. You might or might not find that attractive, but it did resolve Europe's problem, okay? And but they're not willing to accord the same kind of policy towards Belarus for the very reasons that Marcus has explained to us. Go ahead, Maxim.
Right, I agree, and I would also add to that perhaps that I think kind of a midterm challenge here is that Belarus may be kind of turned into what DPRK is for China. You know, when you put too much pressure on Kim and refuse all kind of options for negotiations that may play, you have, you know, North Korea as a strategic leverage for China against regional rivals, but also a big pain in the neck, which I think if the current policies towards Belarus continue, then Russia would have to support Lukashenko on a number of things that may not necessarily be in Russia's own interests, but because you don't really have a better option. Then you have like an even longer problem on your hands. But also, as I mentioned before, the Europeans kind of are playing a tricky role here. You know, on the one hand, they complain about their security, but on the other hand, they refuse to make their own transformation from a payer to a real player.
I think we have to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with Artie.
We're empowering ourselves to be more efficient. We're quicker with our transactions, but with that comes a trade-off. Every device is a potential entry point for a security attack.
Any machine can be hacked.
It's an extension of traditional crime.
The defenders have always been one step behind the attackers.
Доступ к камере в любой момент, доступ к звонкам, сообщениям, приложениям.
It's not a matter of if it happens, it's a matter of when.
While the pandemic knows certainly no borders and is blind to nationalities,
a new virus has emerged. We don't have a therapy. We don't have a vaccine. The whole world needs to take action and be ready.
It's not a joke. People are dying.
God's judgment is coming!
crisis is unprecedented in modern times.
We can do better. We should be doing better.
Everyone is contributing each in their own way, but we also know that this crisis will not go on forever.
The challenge is great, but the response has been massive.
So many good people are helping us.
It makes us feel very proud that we're in it together.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. This is the home edition. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Change gears, gentlemen. Maxime, let's talk about Ukraine. And I have this really bad feeling of deja vu all over again, because we had in the spring mounting tensions, we see a very provocative rhetoric and even behavior. And now we seem to have a repeat. The U.S. Administration, the Biden administration really has increased its interest and at the same time tension within Ukraine here. What is the message they're sending? Because it's very confusing, or maybe that's the whole point, is to be opaque, okay, and to create a sense of unease. But of course, that in itself creates more tension. And obviously, the Russians are watching very carefully about, as I stress over and over again in this problem, this is an intra-Ukraine problem, and they're incessantly trying to pull Russia into it. Your thoughts, my friend. Go ahead.
Well, I think throughout its history, Russia as a continental power had to focus on three major fronts, with the West, in the East with Mongols, and now perhaps we'll keep an eye on China, but also in the South with the entire kind of Central Asia, Middle East direction. So the idea that I think has been very strong in the West, in the US in particular, that Russia's and Chinese alignment may pose a greater challenge and Russia may act as a force multiplier to China is very strong. So one reason to invoke these Ukraine card, so to say, as many policymakers in Moscow believe, is that, that kind of keeps Moscow distracted from the Eastern Front with China and from the Southern Front with Syria and all the Middle East policies, and keep it very, very busy in the West with Ukraine. The second thing, I think you mentioned the deja vu. I even have even more.
Just to kind of follow up on that point, that's very dangerous. I mean, this is not a board game.
Okay, sure.
This is very, very serious. Up to 14,000 people have been killed by the Kiev government in the Donbass. This is not a board game. This is very serious. Sorry to interrupt you. Continue.
It is serious. And then you mentioned, you talked about deja vu, and I have another deja vu with August 2008. And I think that makes me very worried, in the wake of that war in Georgia.
Please explain.
Right. And the war in Georgia in South Ossetia, a couple of months before that 5-day war, Condoleezza Rice, came to Tbilisi, and some say in private she, argued and warned Saakashvili against "quote unquote" provoking Russia and stuff. But in public, then they went and provided security guarantees and stuff. So I think when top American policymakers visit Kiev, and then you speak to people and say, well, they actually encourage Zelensky to focus on fighting corruption and stuff, but that's not what they say in public, though. And they talk about NATO guarantees and security reassurances, all that kind of stuff. So that sends a very dangerous message to authorities in Kiev, and then go and escalate in the east of Ukraine. So that makes me very worried about prospects for what we may see in this crisis.
Marcus, I'm really glad that Maxime brought up August 2008, because I see this scenario playing out again. You have this very public propaganda barrage encouraging the Ukrainians. There's a person named Dmytro Yarosh, who is a known figure, even before the Maidan to the European Union, a ultra-nationalist, even some people would describe him as a neo-Nazi. He's playing another key role in military thinking in Kiev, and his only goal is war. His goal is conflict. And when you have the Secretary of Defense in the United States, giving them these attaboys, and we got your back, and and you're integral to our security, and all the other boilerplate nonsense that NATO is putting out on a daily basis. This creates a very, very dangerous situation, because obviously it's a wag the dog situation that we could play out here, and there will be real consequences. Go ahead, Marcus.
I have long described Ukraine as Russia's soft underbelly, because if Russia has a Ukraine on its border, which is hostile and which is in the West's orbit, then not only is Russia going to be weakened in Europe, but it will be weakened in the world as a whole. And even worse than that, Russian national security will be in peril. And of course, for nearly 8 years now, Ukraine has been in the West's orbit, politically, economically, militarily, also culturally. The West has integrated Ukraine into its orbit. That is not to say, however, that Russia doesn't have leverage in Ukraine, because it most certainly does. So, for example, millions of Ukrainians, not just in the east of Ukraine, not just in the south of Ukraine, but also in the center of Ukraine, regard themselves as part of the Russian world. Nonetheless, Ukraine is in the West's orbit, and America and Britain, which of course are the heart and soul of NATO, are intent on bringing Ukraine into its ranks, because a Ukraine in the ranks of NATO would mean that Russia is encircled on its western border. It would mean that Russian supremacy in the Black Sea region would be seriously compromised, because even as we talk now, Peter, the Americans are refurbishing the ports at Odessa and Ochakov in Ukraine to accommodate American and British warships. So what we see at the moment in the Black Sea region and in Ukraine is an obvious measure that the Americans and the British are going to take. They now have Ukraine in their orbit. They are going to do everything they possibly can, with the exception of defending Ukraine militarily. They will do everything they can to ensure that Ukraine remains in their presence. So what are the options to Russia? Well, Russia does have options in Ukraine. And quite frankly, Ukraine should never have been allowed to enter the West's orbit in the first place. The dangers emanating at the end of 2013 in Ukraine and for Russia were very obvious, but that is water under the bridge, so to speak. The only way that Ukraine can be saved is through Russia taking clinical action. Otherwise, the day will come when Ukraine enters NATO. And people very quickly, Peter, people could say that Ukraine can only join NATO if the situation in the Crimea and the Donbass is resolved. But quite frankly, Kiev could agree to redrawing its borders, whereby it forgets about the Crimea, it forgets about the third of Lugansk and Donetsk, which it has lost. And then in that scenario, Ukraine would be free to join NATO.
Yes, absolutely. And oh, by the way, folks, it doesn't sound right when it comes off, it doesn't roll off the tongue that the UK and the United States are Black Sea powers, because they're not. They don't border the Black Sea, but they're there. Maxime, I mean, the cynic in me tells me is that, kind of echoing what you said here, I mean, given what Marcus had to say, for the United States to create a diplomatic crisis for Russia over Ukraine suits them just fine, okay? I mean, encourage the Zelensky government to have a military assault on what's called the Donbass. Russia will react. Irrespective of the outcome, the U.S. sees it as a victory. Russia would be isolated in the West if it took military action, because Ukraine would not win. I mean, it's a very cynical game, because every bad outcome in Washington is perceived as a good outcome. Go ahead, Maxime.
Well, I think if I were to look at the situation from the U.S. standpoint, it makes sense to, when you have to focus on, rivalry with China, but Russia is still a huge issue. You need to build kind of a new containment, and to contain Russia in the Black Sea and in its border with Ukraine is one option, obviously, and a big one. There's also, I think, an illusion of that you can play the quote-unquote controlled escalation game with Russia, where you supply Ukraine with certain weapons and you maintain a certain degree of violence and escalation and intensity at the border with Russia, and then hope you can still deter Moscow against any hardcore option of retaliation, which I think what the United States has now been trying to do by also sending, CIA chief Bill Burns to Moscow and kind of making all these warning signals against attack. But I think the red lines on Ukraine have been drawn and repeated again and again, and what we're seeing now that they've been violating. And I think the entire situation is now being playing out again around setting new rules and setting new stage for, the Ukraine obviously was not happy with the Minsk Accords.
Absolutely right. And is the gambit here to see if Russia will buckle? It will accept a strategic defeat here. And I think all three of us would agree that that's not in the cards, but that is this perception that the West has is that if a certain combination the Russians will give up. That's not going to happen. And that's why we're doing this segment on this program, because I see this as a collision course. As I said, deja vu all over again. I would like to remind everyone during the spring, tensions were very, very severe to the point where obviously thought a potential conflict was at hand here. Then the Americans said they were going to send in ships into the Black Sea. Then they decided not to. And then for some reason, the UK took the baton and said, we'll go there. I mean, obviously, they realized that gambit didn't work. Why do they think it's going to work now? Go ahead, Mitch.
Well, I hope it's not going to work. But Moscow may also kind of consider some new tactics, perhaps also the ones that may include some use of force to reset the stage and to coerce Ukraine to sign some new terms of agreement. Kiev, obviously, I think, seeks to renegotiate the Minsk Accords that it believes were not in its interest. But I can't agree more with you. It's a dangerous trend towards a new collision course.
15 seconds. Finish up for us, Marcus.
Well, of course, the chances, in my opinion, of a war between Russia and America over Ukraine are negligible, but the chances of an accidental war are very much alive and well.
That's what we worry about here, this miscalculation. When you play a game of chicken, one side may decide to go through with it. And then when one side decides to go through with it, you both end up in it, okay? That's what we're hoping to avoid here. Okay, gentlemen, that's all the time we have here. I want to thank my guests in Moscow and in London. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.